Sculpture Center. Myra Greene was born in New York City and received a BFA from Washington University in St. Louis and her MFA in photography from the University of New Mexico. Myra is a professor of photography and the chair in the Department of Art and Visual Culture at Spelman College. So please give Myra Greene a warm welcome. And without further ado, Myra Greene.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
I'm so excited to be here, and I thank you for what I consider braving the rain to come out this evening. I was in New York during Hurricane Ida, right before the storms got bad, standing with an umbrella, and the wind came and snapped my umbrella in half. I was like, I gotta go home. So I'm now afraid of rain. I'm very excited tonight. I'm going to say for our online friends, you see this messages in chat growing and growing. I probably won't look at those until we're done today. I've done a year and a half of online teaching as well, so I'm not afraid of this context. I'm also vaccinated, so I've taken off my mask so that it's easiest for you guys to hear me. So tonight we're going to talk through the textile work, and I'm very excited to be surrounded by my own work, which is a rare occurrence sometimes as an artist, and take you through this kind of strange transition that a lot of people know me for. So I'm known as a photographer. I've done a lot of work in those museums that was mentioned before by Michael, and I have to stop and thank Michael and Joshua for their time and their grace with hosting me, and also for all the work they've done for the South Arts program. But I am going to sort of take you through this process of my textile work in 45 minutes. I'm a professor, I talk fast, I sometimes curse. It's not you, it's me, it's my nervous energy. And hopefully at the end, this will illuminate how I got to these abstract forms that are sitting on the wall. Because to me, they're embodied and infused with a ton of personal history, a bunch of cultural history. And I think that's important to sort of embrace that and give these objects that grace. So I'm starting kind of where I finished, and in a piece called, well, they're mostly called piecework. A piece that is taken from they're all cotton fabric textiles that are dyed in their complementary color to the color brown. And for many people who know the work that I made previously, pieces like this, which are ambrotypes, historic process, black glass images that are made directly in camera. It seems like a very large stretch. And to me, it seems like a very natural progression, right? But for me, it's 20 years in the life I live, so it's hard to be like, yeah, I have from here to here. It makes total sense. I don't understand why I got that. That's why big talks. But for me, this object, and these are one-of-a-kind objects that you can hold in your hand. They're breakable. You break one, it's gone forever. It's the opposite of the social media Instagram culture, which I didn't know about when I made it, but you know, I don't look down on that. But to me, these center around blackness. There we go. Or these portraits that I made, which come from a series in 2012 that are called My White Friends. And they literally are my white friends. To me, this work also culturally centers on color, on race, on description, on stereotype. And for me, practically, there's one seat left. So for you. For me, this just sort of centers whiteness as a contextual, as a cultural context. And the work was finished in 2012. This image was made in 2007, 2008, 2010. Before we could predict where we are today, right? Before we had this immensely intense conversation around culture, context, and color. But for me, this has been a part of my everyday lived life and practice since I was a young child. So after finishing this work, I kind of was, I still do have a lot of questions about how photography functions. It's E's ability of reading, how it plays into our own stereotypes about the body. And I was interested in sort of recasting or making work again about the body, my body, and its cultural context. And somehow I circled back to African fabrics. And so when I was 16, my mother took me and my sister to Senegal. My sister was 21, I was 16. Just not a time to take a child on a trip at the pool. Like, I just made out with the boys, like, sorry, Mom. But like, that's just what was this influence. I also grew up in New York City. I grew up in Harlem. 125th Street, if you have not been, is this amazing cultural juggernaut energy that sort of pulses, but it's filled with West African and South Bronx energy. I don't know how else to explain it unless you know those two things and put them together. When I was a child, I used to wear African fabrics in my straightened hair, if you can imagine. I can barely imagine. And so I sort of took this fabric and essentially was thinking about what is the essentialness of this. You know, African fabric has a complex history. Sorry, I'm not used to speaking on mic, so I feel like I'm used to speaking in a classroom where you just project until you have no voice, and so don't do that with microphones. It doesn't work. And so I was thinking about the meaning of this fabric, how it instantly reads as African or Black or, and I wanted to essentialize this thing that I thought was essentialized. But I also understood intrinsically that the fabric was complicated in of itself. These fabrics are designed in Europe, printed in East Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and then sent and shipped back to Africa and told as they are authentic fabrics. That is the current state of African fabrics today. And so it is a global politic. It is it's more complicated, and we think it's a simple read, but it really isn't. And so I was like, well, maybe if I understand these shapes better, I can cut them up. I can just do things with them and figure out how to make them work a little bit better. So that's where I began, just sort of buying a lot of fabric, and I have a lot of fabric, and I just would cut out simple shapes and sew them back together. And with a scanner, would scan information, the front and back of things, just sort of like making basic collages, just shapes upon shapes. I'm just so excited, everyone's here. My students would just be like, and I go back to this, I kind of is teaching at a college, and you sort of think about, well, how is this possible? What am I thinking about? This is like one of the few images I made as an undergraduate photo major that stays with me to this day. And I found it as I was working through this project. I was like, of course, this is exactly what I'm thinking about, right? And this is a picture I made in studio of me standing on my African dress, on camera, perhaps 12 feet in the sky, camera release, out of focus, so you can only see that African fabric. And thinking about like how I might be rooted in something, but my head be somewhere else. Like I'm rooted in this Blackness, even though I might materialize or visualize as something else. And it's awkward and body feels broken. And I just really respond to this picture, and I just said, okay, so there's something here that I think describes me in a way I can't even describe myself. And so I started making these collages. They went from, let's put all the same stuff together, to let's put different stuff together. It's just sort of like that. And I say this because people are like, how did you get here? And I'm like, I think the natural process of an artist, like, oh, I'm gonna try this. I'm like, oh, let's try this. Throw this against the wall. Believe me, I throw a lot of things against the wall, and a lot of things fail. And like my sister and good friends laugh at me. So don't think of it. But every once in a while, you make this incredibly elegant, soulful abstraction that you're like, wow, this is the one on my right. You know, people talk about as like ancient text with string and thread, right? And it's really just like African fabrics folded and using sort of a substrate of muslin as a background for that as well. When I started to learn how to do these, I I mean, I say it now, and it's probably not as evident on the wall, works on the wall, but I became very conscious about how thread becomes mark making, how thread becomes path, and trying to find unique ways to both embroider and to think about that as mark making. I also started watching a lot of, I was living in Chicago at the time, and the only way to learn to sew was to watch Wisconsin sewing shows on PBS. And so I would record them and then learn quilting techniques. Because I was teaching full time. I was an associate professor, assistant chair, and I would take night classes in sewing. And then you're like, well, and then you're like, what kind of crazy does this? Like, I'm just like, I'm gonna just do this thing. And I hate embroidery, but I still do it. And then you're like, oh, I have to learn about triangles. Okay. So like these are just like two triangles that are sewn together, and then they're sewn together, and you start to learn how to make pattern out of nothing or out of something really small. All of this work sort of led to my first photographic and textile show. Those abstractions you can see are largely printed on as sort of photo text. I don't know if you're familiar with sticky stuff that goes on the wall, but put it through a photo printer. And I started making my own quilts for a small period of time. And I point to this one, and you can see these markings because I that figure ground, the thread, making a shape that is important and isn't important at the same time. Looking for my phone just because I have no sense. It's picking up. I have no sense of time. There we go. Perfect. So from there, again, I was thinking about mark making and how to incorporate more information. I would say this piece is about, I always have to put the context on it because I see it on screen, I'm like, that's too small. I see it on that screen, I'm like, that's too big. So it's actually a 17 by 17 piece. And you see that white marking that's happening on the front. That's actually etched acrylic, right? The thing that actually protects the image underneath it becomes a layer of information that you have to look through to see. So I just took the, this is when I was like, oh, let's just learn more things about things that you don't need to know. Like how can we use Illustrator or the things that I know how to use, Photoshop, Illustrator. Okay, now I can learn how to cut on a, I can engrave on a printer, right? So I engrave these marks onto that. And then you start to build what I think are just both emotional and physical layers between the pieces. That's not real thread. That is actually still the scan. It's hard to see on this white screen, but it's still the scan of thread, right? And so you're sort of sitting here between the real and there's a trompe l'oeil. There's a weird thing where people, my drunk friends at shows will just put their hands on it, like it's not, it's a photograph. And they're like, really? I'm like, maybe you feel that way because it's not there. And so if you can see from this top picture, you can sort of see, come on, doesn't like me so much. Okay. You can see the etching that's sitting on the top of the image. And then behind it is this another layer of patterning, which is playing with these fabric pieces that I collected over time and the pieces I cut out to make their smaller collages. And so I'm starting to build up what I'm really fascinated by is my own personal language, right? What kind of language am I building by sort of doing these collages? And how can I make that my own specific language about what I do? I say all of this, and then the work all changes. So it's like, oh, right. So that's what I do. Because I think in a way, these were very rooted in the photographic, which I don't have a problem with, right? They sort of use textiles to play the photographic. What do y'all mean? No. You're good? Okay. But then I sort of became, because of all the cutting and the sewing and the, I'm doing all this modification to the fabric to then make a photograph. The question becomes, why don't I just make the textile? And it took a very long time for me to say, well, I'm a photographer. I don't need us photographers. Instead, square on our hips and shudder. And then I was just like, there was one day and I was like, well, what happens if you adapt a different word? What happens if you use the word artist? what happens if you use, if you start using the language a little bit differently, it gives you space to try new things. And new things I tried. So what I essentially did, and I think what I would say is I like to use tools that I know and understand. Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign. I can sit on a computer all night and look at something and play with it over and over again. So what I would do, or what I had an assistant do, is scan all of I had them scan over 300 pieces of fabric that I had of African textiles. And I would just flip through it. And when you're looking at these fabrics, you start to recognize patterns. And really what it is, if you look at this, can you guys see the mouse? Nope. Oh yeah, there it is on the upper left-hand side. This small little piece right here, this small little piece right here. Some of these yellows, these oranges and magenta. I would digitally lift those out. What that is Dutch wax textiles, like it's the release of the Dutch wax. And I felt that was like, when I kept looking, I was like, this is the code that's embedded in everything. And you don't know it, right? And it starts to lead to the, it's totally fake and it's not really printed and it's not a real release in any way. But this has started the Africanness that is troping all of these fabrics to me. So I took those and I always look this way because they're, you guys, I'm just always like making sure you're good, like what did I do wrong? Okay, I keep dancing. Okay. This is me very controlled right now. My students were like, remember when you told us about that dream? I was like, I don't remember. So this pattern I would collect digitally. And then I would make a pattern out of that pattern to make a silk screen. I had to take a silk screening class. It just sort of happened along the embroidery class, there was a sewing class, there was BPS, and then there was like a silk screening class. And I am a terrible student because I'm like, this is what I'm gonna do. And I'm sorry. And teach me what you think I need to learn. And then I'm not gonna do it. Like, because they're evening classes, right? And it's like adult education. And so the great part of it is that my friend, they became friends and they became partners and friends and taught me how to do a lot of things. But that's how this all, it started with a lot of other things. My sister's like, that's hideous. And so I would take that pattern, silk screen it, and I kind of had two patterns. I had a small scale. This mouse, it comes and goes. Okay, so I had a small scale pattern. And when you silk screen, you just add different color inks, and that's how you do it over and over again. And then I had a large scale pattern. And I would print one thing, one piece of fabric, one color, one piece of fabric, another color. And then I would put them back together using the quilting techniques. And over time, lots of really weird things started to happen, right? We had some really great interplays with color, started really thinking of, a lot of abstraction that would happen, both because I'm a bad silk screener and ink would sometimes not go through or come through too much. And then I use the back of the fabric because I don't care, front, back, who cares, right? And so you get all of this different types of information. And this is sort of the moment where I sort of embrace that information. I'm this person as a faculty member, if I like something, I say make 20. Like I just look at them, I go 20, and I walk away, and they're like, oh. And then someone threw a cartoon of me, which just says 20. I was like, that's pretty good. So what these images here, I think the one behind you is 37, maybe 30, I don't know. I kind of don't remember numbers. No, that one's something different. We'll get to that. That's something different. So like that, but that one particular is 37?
Yeah, 37.
37.
Yeah.
So just to make you, like people don't get it when I say 20, I mean 20. And there's a transition that happened, obviously, from something that is square to something that refers to photography that has a contained frame. All of these things, and this might be like 15. I think I number 34. No, it's later. I will get that. Okay. So just because I knew there would be a lot of students in the room. there's a lot of reference that sort of is capsulated and uncapsulated in a lot of this. A lot of it comes through an abstraction or a history of art abstraction that might not be the first part of art abstraction that you would think about, which is actually through Black artists. And so we have artists like Howardina Pindell, Jack Winton, William T. Williams, artists who are part of Soul of the Nation. Great thing. You should, every person, Black, white, Puerto Rican, that's song, should read about, but also have a lot of other interests and influences through color theory. So I think it's fascinating that Annie Albers was married to Joseph Albers, right? A painter who continually thinks about how perception and color works together with paint, and his wife is like, I'll beat you, I'll do it with textiles. It's hard with textiles. This is a Joseph Albers piece on the right-hand side. What my favorite game was in the middle of the pandemic in the New York Times was this like game match color thing, and it's just, it drives your eyes crazy, and then you have to like figure out which ones go together. And like, this is such a Joseph Albers, oh my God, this is a hyper intellectual over East Coast liberalism New York Times moment, and I enjoyed it. So it's really funny because everyone's like, well, how? I always talk about color being contextual, racially, culturally. And people, and even thinking about my white friends, my photographic series, and they're like, why do you think about this all the time? Well, it's really easy. It's a history that some of you may know, some of you may not know, but I was that Black girl, Upper East Side. Lady Gaga went to my high school 20 years after me. That's right. That's right. Meaning no, you know. Okay. But I was that girl. I was the Black girl in an all-white class. My sister was the super smart one who could do 7th grade math in 4th grade. And so they're like, yes, we want her. And then my mother was like, you got another one. I was like, oh, I'm a Black girl. And I somehow went to this awesome private school for 11 years. But I was always conscious of my contextualization of race, right? I always took the M1 bus down Fifth Avenue, leaving Harlem to the Upper East Side, 91st Street, to be amongst my peers who I loved and cared for. But I think that people forget that those types of experiences are will quintessentially make me think about color differently than most. Oh, this is my color personal stories time. Welcome. It's a good time. So we went to China. I went to China on my last job with Ross and Peter in the upper right picture. And we took 2 graduate students. It's the first time in China, and it's a tremendous place, and I highly recommend it to everyone. But everywhere we went, Ross, who's still a good friend, he's like, everyone is staring at me. It's like, well, I am a 6-foot tall Black woman in the middle of China. Like, and he's like, how are, and like at the end of every day, he's like, how are you dealing with this? I was like, I deal with this every day. You might not see it every day, but every day I'm misunderstood as to why I'm in this place and my context being managed. And so we went to this big photo festival, and he's like, no, you don't understand. I was like, no, I understand. There are a bunch of people with cameras photographing me right now. He's like, yeah, I turned around and I made this photograph. I'm not joking. Now, this is an articulation of what was happening. I mean, I would sit on steps and then they would walk up to Peter and show, like, they had these crazy lenses. They would walk up to Peter and show them pictures of me eating breakfast. But what does that mean, right? What does it mean to visually be interested in difference? Is it a bad thing? I don't know. But this was like my favorite picture. He's like, how are you dealing with this? I was like, I'm really not conscious of the process until you bring it up. Now I'm totally freaked out. Nothing happened. Like, it's totally fine. This is my friend Mia Seema. She's Indian. We went to Greece together. We went to the islands right before COVID. We were in, not Mykonos, Pyros, and we checked in, and literally for the 3rd time, someone goes, "You 2 sisters?" Right. Like over back, it's like, what? No, we ain't sisters. Like, so what does it mean globally to have a very different understanding and contextualization of power? And seam is rad. She texted me this week for no good reason about the Uffizi, and I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But we are both brown sisters, but we are not brown sisters, right? Come from very different cultural and ethnic paths. So when I go back to photograph my white friends, it's really difficult for people are like, I want to talk to you about, I was like, well, that's great. You read this man as a very different person than I read it, because he's my brother-in-law. Right? Context matters. How and where you place that color matters. And that matters on racial lines and on color lines and professional lines. So to go back to the dyeing, because I have, perfect, 12 minutes left. 14 minutes left. No, I can't do that. 17 minutes left. I'm gonna get it. How did this start? It started with just complete madness of me learning color and something I didn't know, and learning how to dye. And so I figured out how to dye. That was like a year. I do these projects, like, it's like, oh, you did some black glass on amber types. Yeah, it took me 3 years to figure it out. And then I made gorgeous plates. And then with the dyeing like this, I don't even know what year it is. I remember I would ship this to my friends. I guess it was, yeah, I must not have been living in Chicago, because I would ship stuff to a friend's house and he's like, your dyes are here. And I'd be like, great, I'll get it tomorrow. Like go to that weird adult learning place and dye fabric all day, and they're gonna be like, what is she doing today? And so what became really interesting was learning about how to dye ombre, which is a course of, I truly believe there's a lot of technical stuff you have to do to make art, and you just have to learn it. So this was a matter of time and temperature and sort of volume of dye. And so I quickly learned how to do that with brown, and then sort of had a conversation or sort of thinking about the color wheel. And what happens intrinsically, and we can use this one as the best example of that. I'm sorry, people online, you don't get to know. There's a piece, and it goes from purple to golden, right? And what's happening essentially is that I am dyeing a light lilac fabric, its complementary color, which pushes it. Some people say immediately to yellow. I don't think it's yellow. I think it's something else. But that's what I do. So you can see this happening. And as I got better and an assistant, assistants again are wonderful. We started dyeing larger and larger bats of fabric. And sort of that's what happened. And so for pieces like these two mixed, the fabric was dyed in a totally different manner. They were cut into strips, dyed in separate bins, and then washed. And this method, because they were sort of balled up and not really agitated, allowed for a lot of that patterning to occur. So more stories by Myra Greene. So this is a picture of my father and my mother. My mother and my father's wedding. I love this picture. My mother hates this picture. Yeah, because her face is covered. But there's like this elegant, weird photographicness about it that I love. But my father was a cool guy, a dark man, who I actually never knew. My father died when I was 6 months old of cancer in 1976. But so there's this saying in the Black community. I hate saying that, but like folks will say like, oh, he's black as a frying pan, dark as night, you can only see his eyes. You know, every black person was like, yep, got it, know it. And that's how my father was often described. And my mother is a paler version. You can sort of see her eye poking out the side. So that leads to versions of me being comfortable with blackness or brownness being described in really heavy, dark terms, right? This blue, brown, black. And again, I also really love making objects that only make sense when you see them in person. Like, and we'll get to that because you'll see it on the screen and be like, that's not what that looks like. I'm like, no, because that's the real thing. Like, come see the show. That's me being selfish. These are my grandmother. My grandmother is 95. She turned 95 on September 1st. I'm very happy about that. She is. I will get a mouse. This is her. And these are her sisters. But the funny thing about my grandmother and her sisters is they all passed for white. To this day, people think my grandmother's Jewish. And people have pulled me away from her saying, stop attacking that woman. And I'm like, my grandma's, I'm a proud black woman. And you're like, okay, let's not do this here. Let's just keep going. So to me, these lighter shades, these wonderful tones, these are the generation of women that raised me. I've always been enamored with, even though we are kinfolk, we have totally different skin. This is her sister, my Aunt Rosie. Her name is Geraldine, but we called her Rosie because she was as pretty as a rose. And here you sort of see that sort of grace and elegance that comes with, and they're all Harlemites, like second generation Harlemites living through the 40s in Harlem. The pictures are insane sometimes, and you're like, that was a life, like who did that? And so to me, that purple, I mean, it's the same with that piece, but that purple to brown, that light skin tone color is really, in some ways, a part of my family story and a part of my family lineage. To continue with that, so we have these big pieces of fabric. I then had a customized table built that's 4 feet long. I take those fabrics and then I silk screen the appropriate color to them, or the color I feel works. And when I think happens, it happens in the piece in the back, it happens on this. No, things happening out there, but where's my mouse? There it is. Where's the, oh, okay, I'm just gonna point. So what happens is this is the same color blue, right? But as it sits in yellow or tan or brown, it changes. The context of the color itself changes as the context surrounding it changes, which to me describes Greece and China and all of those things. That my physical context, my color was totally based on the context that I lived in. And so it's this very simple color metaphor, but it's a very important thing to sort of see in the pieces. And what happens in the pieces also happens in those collages, is things sort of fall, push back, pull forward, trump ploy, all those things that I think I was working on with those photographic representations of textiles happens with those actual fabrics. Yeah, and I'll stop that. So that's one of that wall. But I think it looks better in real life. I'm just saying. Do you need a moment? It's also like screens and my eyes. It's like, oh, that's the real thing. I know I know how I put that together. So they change in size and scale. I think after working on things, you know, I talked about that black glass, which is smaller than my phone originally, something sitting in my hand. This fabric gave me the opportunity to make a piece like this. This is 40. I know this is 40. This is number 40 piece working out. Which is actually 4 pieces that are laid out as one. It's about 25 pieces, 25 feet long. Yeah. Oh, they wanted that here. So we don't want that here. That's a gotcha to install. This is the number 39. It's 10 feet by 10 feet. So what happens also is the ability to change scale. Because now I'm working not with something I felt like I had more control over, but I think this also A, way better in real life. B, you can really see how that green print changes its tone. I don't know what this is, but I do love it. Oh, my phone's upstairs. 10 minutes. So there's certain things that I did talk about. I briefly touched on just sort of the idea of the triangle and how it becomes this formula. It becomes so important in the work and just sort of how I construct things, basically because of PBS in Wisconsin, but also sort of the metaphoric meaning of that as well. It could be because no one laughs at this. It's so funny. It's a triangle. It's where the triangle defense began in basketball. Come on, folks. No. So that's because I was just sitting there and I was watching what that weird documentary, which name I don't remember, and I was like, oh, it's a triangle. I was like, I'm a Knicks fan, and so of course I hate the triangle. That's the worst thing ever. Destroyed Healy. He deserved a ring. And move on. But when we think of a triangle, I think of the African diaspora, right? We think of that exchange of goods, people, humans to cotton to rum. And to also say, to be mindful and say that's an African diaspora, and diasporas exist actually in trading of indigenous people happen all across the world, and to not just make that only Black thing, but it happens a lot of places. But I would, again, this is another moment where I would take these patterns or see things and recognize their lines and their shapes and integrate them into my work. And so if you remember, you go back to that quilt piece that had that weird line work on it. And it was just this, right? It was just sort of being like, oh, because now I know how to program in an embroidery machine to make this happen, and then I can make it happen and then we incorporate it into a quilt. So I think there's ways to embed symbolism that may not be immediately readable, but is easily translatable to the work of people. But I also think about the triangle of my family. So this is my mother and my sister, and I'm taking the picture. And I think about that triangular relationship as well. My mother stayed in New York for her entire life. My sister lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I've been like bouncing around the country. And so there's always this triangle. I think of like how the phones work and the signals being like, beep, 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 beep. I don't know. It's the triangle that I think of my family. Since my father died when I was young, it was the three of us. And so that 3-point access is something that's really important to me as well. To conclude, because there are a couple of pieces in here, including the one I'm standing behind, sorry. Okay, do that later. That sort of took on a new process. And what's happening is you're starting to see, if you look at the piece behind you again, you see it's a single color print. And what I started doing recently, it wasn't recent, I don't even know, in the COVID year. Yeah, it's hard to explain because I'm also like, I got kicked out of that studio on that. So I started laying down a pattern, and I made, that's what I did. I made silk screens that were both the positive and the negative pattern. And so I could then start thinking about, I talk a lot about figure and ground when I teach, and how the ground can serve you. What can you make the ground do that instead of just putting a figure on top of it? And it's not a photographic way of thinking, but it is a photographic way of thinking. And so if you can imagine, hello mouse, all of this blue is here, this pink is then background is laid down in one color. So I'm taking that fabric and I'm printing it, letting it sit, printing it again, and going back and forth between the figure and the ground, trying to create a different type of information. And so because I'm not well-trained / don't care printmaker, a lot of fun things start to happen because nothing's registered. It's all done by hand and vision and just sort of patience and saying, I think it goes, and like there's a moment when your screen gets fucked up and you're like, I think it goes here. It doesn't, okay. Next one, you're like, perfect. Because there's no reason, there's here somewhere in there. There's no reason that like this edge, I shouldn't have been that close. I just shouldn't. But then I'm happy I wasn't that close because the blue comes out and you realize what's going on. Oh, I don't always use words. So if we look at this piece, which is also behind you over here, these new pieces are called the Tailor Pattern. Because I realized there are two different ways to think about this. I think there's an application of ink that's a little bit different. Obviously with these blue, that blue pocket. And then you still see that transformation happening. It still works with that African Dutch wax pattern. But what I'm also doing is I'm playing with scale. So after making a very large piece and being overwhelmed by it, I decided to make these smaller pieces, which that represents. And so I take that and then I photograph it and then I make a pattern of it and then I blow it up 5 times at scale. So this is the representation of the blow up, right? And so it gives me an opportunity to, not of that blow up, but of a different blow up. I don't even know if I don't think I have it in there. Nope, I don't have it. And so it gives me an opportunity to work small again, to do something really intimate, but then say, when is it appropriate to make something of a larger scale and size? And that has a lot, it's a different type of challenging in a lot of different ways. But I think this new work, and it's again called the Tailor Pattern, it challenges me to think through a lot of the ideas that I was working through before, a lot of fabric that I was working through before, but then also say, well, am I just making things big to be big, or should they be big for a space, or does that space need this, blah, blah, blah. So it gives me a lot of different opportunities to work out a lot of different ideas. So with that, in a whopping 2 minutes ahead of schedule, I am so proud of this. I might say that I also am a New Yorker, so I talk too fast. I thank you all for your time. Oh, and clock. And if there are any questions. It's like, things are gonna, okay.
You froze halfway through. So that's okay. Not the screen, but you.
Me,
Yeah,
just you.
But I can still
Oh,
watch
that
your
sucks.
We're just gonna redo it real quick, so,
Okay.
y'all think about some questions to ask Myra Greene while we do that real quick. And then for those that are combo, once the questions are over, I'm gonna put sheets on this table, so y'all can do that once questions are over. That doesn't mean you should.
Wait, what's the sheet?
Convocation credit for the students, so, for,
We do that.
it's important, don't forget about that part. So, yeah.
Questions,
Any questions?
comments, go ahead. What's your name?
Kate,
Hi, Katie.
hi. I was wondering the dyes you use, like what kinds of dyes or what's like the origin of them? And I mean, because I've done some fabric dye for personal projects, which I mostly go with synthetic ones who the material, but I know cotton have a lot more options available.
So I am not a dye expert. And so the first time I started doing all of it, I used cotton. I only used cotton. And use MX dyes with that cotton. And so that's kind of the only place I can start, because synthetic dyes do a totally different thing. Wools and felts need heat and a different dye base. I use MX, did I say that? I use MX dyes. They use a different thing. And I never learned that thing, but I could tell you who knows that thing in Atlanta. And if you're into wools, if you're into synthetics, I'm lost. I don't know how to do that. So my theory was always, and I think this comes from photography. You make like 8,000 test strips, and then you're like, and now I'm ready to make 8,000 prints. And then you're like, and then now I have a print. So I was willing to go through that process of just that image of me just making strips of color, and they all actually are time-based too. So they also say like 15, 30, 45 minutes on them. Cotton dyes or MX dyes require warm water and salt and soda ash to activate it, but that soda ash actually dies, like it expires, sort of like fix in 45 minutes. So that it gives you an interesting leniency as to like, and now I'm gonna go do something else, because I can just leave my TA, my sister's like, just leave it overnight. I was like, doesn't matter, it exhausted 45 minutes. Like after that, what are we doing? We're wasting our time. So it's just sort of knowing that history, and I have a lot of weird books about that too. I'm also used bookstores are really good for that stuff. There's one in Decatur that rocks. Didn't really, I don't think I helped you at all, is my answer.
What's the name of that bookstore?
I have no idea. Half books?
Half books.
I think so. It's next to the Joann's in Decatur. Yeah, it's like right next to half price books. I just see half books in my head.
That question just led me to another question that's kind of related. You get such incredible range of tonality, hue in the objects. And I remember you said you didn't like the video version so much. I was just wondering about, well, they're different, right? Luminous versus reflective. But what about stability?
Oh, these are stable.
I mean, dyes change and fabrics change.
No, once it's kind of like everything else, once you fix it, it's pretty much in there. I mean, or rather, my answer is I'll be dead when it when it changes. I might not be alive. I always tell this story. I saw a talk by Christian Boltanski, amazing French artist who died earlier this year. And he said, a museum came to me and said, Mr. Boltanski, and he's French, he's like, Mr. Boltanski, your piece, it's fading. And then he's like, oh no, that's not my piece. That's your piece. Like a little French man, I was like, $1. Like, that's what I want to be. Like, no, by the time this is over, like, and then he's right. Like, there's sort of a thing that in my world, the inks, the dyes were declared stable.
But the video is notoriously not.
The video is notoriously not. And it's the, it goes back to the glass plate thing. I can try to explain to people time and time again, I'm like, it doesn't work until you see it live. And I really believe in making individual objects that are one of a kind, that are linked to me, that they can't be linked to anybody else. That's a part of my personal art practice. But that's my relationship to materiality, which I think I didn't even touch on. Like, I believe in object making. So there's that. Yes. Oh, got it. Sorry.
Would you ever want to make one that represents yourself, like the color of dyes that represents you?
That's like a good question. And in the back of my head, I'm like, all of these are totally me. They, I don't know what he's doing. He's admitting people into the room. Because I'm not paying attention. It's ask me more about that. I don't know if I understand it completely.
Like, would you ever want to do like one of those like that's all about you? Like, put your personality into color. Which color matches your personality?
No, I think every single one of these do. I think I've been like incredibly serious and completely weird at the same moment. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think I've been humorous and serious and edgy and conservative, and I color to me, I mean, it's a word you often hear in class. Is there such a spectrum of possibility, right? In terms of brightness and contrast, in terms of luminosity, and I really think that describes the way I act. And people are like, God, you're really down today. I'm like, can I? Don't be a sour bitch. You know, like I think that's all of it, right? that's just who you are. So I don't think I guess some of that, and showing the pictures of my grandmother and Aunt Rosie, is when people are like, but that's not brown. And brown is my skin tone, right? Did I say that in the talk? I don't know if I did. But like, brown is my skin tone, but I also recognize that fluidity of brownness is so encapsulating. So when it turns to that brown black skin, and people don't see the brownness in that, or to me the blackness in that, I immediately like, well, that's my dad. And that's my, that color reminds me of my Aunt Rosie or Aunt Gloria. In some ways there's this, I could go on to each one, like, and then there's this guy, and then you're like, stop talking. So I guess the question becomes representation of you versus real likeness of you. I don't know. There's something in there that I'm trying to, there's something in there that I have not got answered, which I will get to it, right? And then answer for you. Did you have a question? No, you're just staring at me. Okay. It's the mask thing when you're like, I can't tell what people want from me. Any other questions?
Do you feel like your work is leading to somewhere different right now? Do you think you're going to continue with what you're making like in this round?
I think, I know I'm interested. I have big photographic questions, and I want to answer them with fabric. I don't know how to understand that. I have like a thing that I'm going through, and that it's like the beginning of me going to an embroidery class every Thursday night and showing up and being like, these women are like, no, this is not what we do here. We make clouds with thread. And I'm like, I'm just gonna stitch this thing until I I know what a material. Oh, I'll say one other thing. The woman who taught me how to embroider this stuff also taught me how to hang this stuff, taught me how to put the back casings on. Like some of these people became my friends, are now MFA students in textiles programs. Like they're really smart, ingenious people. So as much as I bothered them, I also like am indebted to them forever. I'm interested in the edge of visuality. What am I poking at? I'm admitting something new. I'm interested in the edge of like photography, or what photography can capture. I was also with, and who I was talking about earlier, I was in Sonia Young James's studio, and she dyed a fabric magenta and then tried to take that magenta to the paint store, and the paint store couldn't match it. It was a color that she had like literally created that was unmatchable by technology. And I'm like interested in like, well, what is that edge where we can't replicate it, but it's obviously there. And it's obviously something that absorbs and reflects color at the same time. And so we can't make a paint out of that. What is that? We don't really think about what is the edge of photography. But I do think there's an edge to color. And I do think there's an edge to framing. That's sort of what I'm thinking about. I'm in a really gassy stage, you know, like cumulus cloud stage of production. Where you're just like, you write these questions down, you read them, and they're like, did you have a burden last night? Yes. So, no, yes.
You talked a lot about how you feel your work is best seen and experienced in person. Do you think a gallery is the best place to experience that work? What do you think is the most authentic space to your art?
That's interesting. I think that what I love about the show and some shows is that, as I fell into my own piece, is this openness to feeling like you're not blocked by the work. I had a show at the High, and in order to see the work, they had to get the case because security, and then there's a reflection, but it's a piece of glass, and so you couldn't see the work, and it was kind of stupid. So I think there's, in some ways, the safety of the gallery, meaning that like you have a mindset that you're going to see a weird object and blah, 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 but also not the overprotectiveness of it. So I think a gallery allows that more than a museum. But then I don't think these could just like hang at the local coffee shop either, right? Because they would be sort of, I think these need contextualization that they are art pieces, and that's what a gallery and museum provide. So I haven't really thought about them in a big sense. They were, I think, no, it wasn't that one. One of them, the last slide was on a billboard, and I was like, nobody understands. Like it was just like this. I was just like, Myra Greene artist, and it's like that doesn't. And again, it's not the object itself; it's a representation of the. I mean, I went to grad school with in my photo talk. I talk a lot about this. I went to grad school with the amazing Thomas Barrow, who would make photographs with an 8x10 camera, huge negative, and then take an ice pick to the negative, and cancel it, and then make a print. And it's called the Cancellation Series, 1973. And all of you are like, what? It's like, because you were not looking at the thing, you're looking through a photograph, through an optical illusion to understand what's going on behind that. And it's like, God damn, that's good. Right? I don't know. For me, I was like, oh, Tom. And he's like totally loony, and I love Tom to this day. But there are ways you can sort of activate thinking in your own process about what are you looking at. The photograph is not the thing. It's the flattening of the thing. It's the anyway. That's a whole other workshop. You know? Let's start the thing, then I go into a thing, and then you.
What did you say his name was?
Thomas Barrow. It's called the Cancellation Series. Isn't that amazing? I just want to take an ice pick to something. Maybe that's just for the drive. But I'm not making an 810 negative to take an ice pick.
Take an ice pick to your screen.
That would rip. It's actually not my screen.
You don't have to worry about it
Yeah.
There's sometimes I'm like, no, that's something that turns these screen. And then I'm like, oh, I should pay for it. And then I don't. One day I'll just show up at his house with some screens. I have bought screens since then. But the original wooden screens, he's like, I don't want these wooden screens. I'm like, I'll take them. I don't know what I'm doing with them. I still have them. Anyone else? I apologize to the online world. We're gonna have to look at those questions later.
Oh, there aren't any.
We, yeah,
Oh,
there
there
were
aren't
a few
any?
early on, but many of them were just compliments.
Oh, kindness.
Oh, a lot of compliments.
I like
Yeah.
compliments. I mean, what's going on?
What's your average screen count?
Oh God, I'm really bad at that. I am a horrible printmaker. I always tell people that because I'm like, and the reason, and it explained to me why I could be a horrible printmaker. And then I was like, well, fine. So I think I have like 130s and 190s because I don't have sharp edge. Like it doesn't matter if the edges are sharp and it doesn't matter if it's clean or not, especially as I start to print over things. Like I go for like the cheapest combination of size to thing. And my screen size, I'm now, it's like what I can hold on my hip. So what is that, like 24, 30 maybe? And so I can put it on my hip with my, I have an apron on. And one day I looked at my apron, I was like, you should stop doing that. And I can walk around and then reposition and then go.
Got one question actually now, right after I said there weren't any. We've got from someone on the chat, they said, they keep returning to the ideas of self-care and centering oneself and how that relates to conversations around opacity, hiding in plain sight, and such, or even African fractals. So they said their question is related to labor, healing, and the physical demands that the works require in contrast to your earlier image-based works.
Well, that, I think the interesting thing is that if you've ever made an amber type, you'll know it is a labor intensive, evil thing. It's evil. No, they're beautiful, they're wonderful, but they are labor intensive. I think I am a person who enjoys labor. I'm a person who enjoys where my back hurts, yes. And I think with photography, there's a moment where you're like, oh, these chemicals are kind of make me loopy, right? But that's something I enjoy. I say the same thing with Photoshop as well. There's a moment when you're like, oh, I literally now go, oh, 3 hours, let's stop. Let's fold a piece of laundry and like understand what real objects are. So I think that is a part of that. Does conversations around care and personal care and craft are newer than my practice? Meaning I'm 45, I'm doing this since, like when we were 18, I say we to the people who are older. We didn't talk that way, right? We didn't work that way. It wasn't like I'm going to take care of myself by doing this repetitive action. It's just sort of, I'm doing this thing because I like it. And so care and therapy sort of is a different language than I would apply to my practice, but I understand why people apply that language. Like people apply a lot of language around craft. Actually, for the South Arts thing, it was like, what category do you fit into? And I was like, I'm gonna pick craft because, you know, I don't know what else it is. Like I can call it mixed media, but no, it's, you know. And so there's associations with language and current vibes that I don't always think I fit into. And I just sort of check boxes and like, yeah, we can have a whole conversation about feminist labor. Do you really want to? We could. I don't put that in my talk, but like, yeah, I understand that this is a marginalized activity that is seen as women's work. But then when you make it weird abstract shapes and start talking about color, it's all an art. Well, that's weird. Isn't that weird? Mm-hmm. We all church, the church says amen. I'm just saying. So it's interesting how you can maneuver or use these conversations. I'm mindful of all of that. But I like making shit.
There we go.
Sorry, I cursed.
I think that's a good one. If there are no other questions, I want to apologize to those online, the camera pros, we, had some technical difficulties. It's amazing how well James is coming up and you're just talking along.
I teach all day, this is my job.
But let's give Myra Greene a hand. What an amazing talk. Thank you, Myra. Thank you all from the Bartlett Center, the South Arts Exhibition. We really didn't expect such a big crowd. We had like 35 people online and 30 from here. We were only expecting very small groups so we could have this intimate experience with Myra's work right here in the space. I agree with Myra. You have to see the work in person. It's much different. I didn't understand the work until we started painting. I was like, oh.
No, it's
Now I'm figuring it out.
And everyone's like, huh? I'm like, don't
Yeah.
worry about it.
Yeah, but now it makes so much sense, and thank you for giving us context. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you, appreciate it, thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
No,
Y'all please finish off the fruit. If you don't, like, no one will. So please take as much fruit as you can.
I want a piece of fruit.
All right. Just take as much fruit as possible. And then sign the condo sheets. They're out. Yeah, I know.